So
started.
one thing to keep in mind that many people overlook this today is that from I would say 1200 to 1900, around that time, Sufism in the broad sense was extremely popular and mainstream throughout Islamic society. So according to Shahab Ahmed in his book What is Islam, in his words, the absolute majority of Muslims in the what he calls the uh, Balkans to Bengal complex, i.e., we're talking about the wider Muslim society. The absolute majority of Muslims participated in the institutions of Sufism. And what we mean by that is Sufism in the form of a organized tariqah, that's one form of the Sufi institution, or Sufism in the sense of shrine culture, right? Visiting shrines, seeking intercession of the Sufi saints known as the awliya, or basically, even without a formal tariqa affiliation, um, participating in Sufi zikr circles, Sufi poetry sessions, this sort of thing, right? Sama. So the Sufi institutions and Sufi practice was mainstream, and it integrated what we today call Sunni and Shia manifestations of Islam. This is quite well known, even whether it's Iran or Egypt, Syria, even in the Hijaz. A lot of people don't know this, but before the rise of Wahhabism in the Hijaz, many Hijazi scholars were mystics. They fully participated in uh, Sufi practices and Sufi metaphysics. So Ibrahim Qurani, among others, was a Sufi in the tradition of Ibn Arabi. Ibrahim Qurani. He believed in the Hakika Muhammadiyah, but he was also a practicing Sufi. And another remnant from this era is the person known as Amir Abdul Qadir, right? Amir Abdul Qadir is known as a someone who led a holy a jihad against the French colonialists, and then later on he actually protected he saved the lives of, I think, thousands of Christians in Syria from a mob of Muslims. He's very famous, Amir Abdul Qadir. But what people don't know is that Amir Abdul Qadir was a Sufi in the Ibn Arabi tradition, and he's a remnant of this pre-modern era. So this was the situation before, some of important developments, which would basically be Wahhabism and various modern Muslim movements, whether they would be modernist movements, like, associated with Sayyid Ahmed Khan and these people, or revivalist movements, right? Like the Deobandis, for example, or like the movement of Sayyid Qutb and these types. So what differentiates these modern forms of Islamic movements, right, Wahhabis included, is the lack of balance between mythos, logos, nomos, pathos, and experiential forms of Islam. The Sufi tradition, including its Sunni and Shiite manifestations across the Muslim world, the Sufi tradition had a balance of all these different elements. And depending on someone's spiritual type, you could veer toward logocentric forms of Sufism or Islamic philosophy or Ismaili or Twelver philosophy if you could be more logocentric, uh, or you could be more mythocentric, or you could be more pathocentric. And of course, the idea of Sharia and fiqh is there, the nomos is there. But I mean, let's be honest, as Shahab Ahmed has noted, um, the Sharia manifestation of Islam was not central. It was there, but it was not central. These other forms of Islam, whether it's the metaphysical form of Islam, the poetic, devotional forms of Islam, This was far more prevalent in pre-modern times, but this changes with the advent of Wahhabism and various modern Muslim movements. And what differentiates Wahhabis as well as the modern Muslim movements is that their discourse, their way of talking about Islam and enacting Islam, is disproportionately nomocentric and logocentric. And it's as if they threw out the mythos, the pathos, and the metaphysics. They just don't deal with that. The modernists really didn't, they were really not into metaphysics. Although, to be honest, when you start reading them, some of the early modernists, like Sayyid Ahmed Khan, they did think about these things, but the modernist project is so much more focused on, socio-political, economic matters, which of course it had to be focused on because colonialism had come and really like ruined everything. But when you focus on, the nomos to the exclusion of others, uh, eventually these other forms of discourse go underground, they die out, and this sort of thing. So one source of the dilemma or the problem or the imbalance that the modern and the Wahhabi movements brought along is the wider Sufi Muslim tradition had become very popular, and as a result, the Sufi and Shiite forms of metaphysics, which have always been quite important among the masses, this metaphysics was not articulated just in the logical format, which you would still learn in the madrasa system, but it was articulated in the form of, you could say, devotional expression, poetry, Qawwali, Marzia, these sort of things, right? And that's fine, right? Popular poems like Qasida al-Burda and the Mevlid Molid poem of Chalabi, among others. There's so many examples I could give. In the Ismaili tradition, we have something called Ginans. We have Sufiana, Kalam in South Asia. We have Qawwali. So these devotional expressions for many rank and file Muslims, that served as their way to participate in the metaphysics of Shiism and Sufism, rather than actually studying the metaphysics philosophically. And that was all fine. It served the spiritual needs of Muslims in many societies. But then the Wahhabi movement comes along, right? And the modernist movements come along, and for different reasons, they took issue with all of this. They took issue with Islamic esotericism. They took issue with metaphysics. And we know what happened, right? The Wahhabis innovated this idea, which, to my knowledge, little to no Muslims before them had this conclusion, but the Wahhabis came up with this idea that seeking the intercessory blessings of the Prophet Muhammad, his family, the Shiite Imams, and the saints, that this was shirk, that this is polytheism. The Wahhabis innovated this. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab seems to have just come up with this and indirectly claimed that it's a result of divine inspiration, that nobody before him had realized this. This is like the major sin of the Wahhabi movement. So they constructed an entire theological discourse attacking the most popular practices in Islamic lands, which was even done in the Hijaz. And as I mentioned, in the Hijaz, you had scholars who followed the tradition of Ibn Arabi, who did intercessory prayers and shrine visitations, ziyarah, all this stuff. And suddenly the Wahhabi movement comes along and tramples over this. And we're all aware of the bloodshed that they caused. So that's one manifestation of this change. And in recent times, we all know the Wahhabi movement has evolved, and today the loudest Islam, and by loudest, I don't mean the most popular and I don't mean the most correct, but the loudest, right? The loudest Islam today is based on Wahhabism. They call themselves different things: Salafis, Atharis, Hanbalis. But that's the loud Islam today, and it continues to be a combination of logocentric and nomocentric to the exclusion of mythocentric, uh, pathos, experience, and metaphysics. So that's one hand. And on the other hand, you have these modernist discourses, some of which are uh, Islamic modernism, which is like the Sayyid Ahmed Khan type modernism, Chirag Ali, which, to be fair, was well intentioned and did focus on important issues, but they did it to the expense of metaphysics and esotericism and Sufism. And then you also have these manifestations of political Islam, right, that reduce Islam to just a nation state. This ideology is associated with Sayyid Qutb and Maududi, right, where they just talk about Islam as if it's just like a nation state. And they're quite modern, even though they're revivalists, they're quite modern because they've been influenced by the European idea of a state, and the European state is extremely nomocentric and hegemonic in how much control it exerts over the population. So these are some important, both the Wahhabi and these modern revivalist and modernist movements, they're all modern movements, right? They're all modern movements. They're all recent, and they are a stark departure from the Sufi spiritual centered Islam that predominated Muslim societies in its Shiite and Sunni forms since 1100, since 1100, where the pioneers of this integration, like Ghazali, had forged this synthesis between tradition and Sufi spirituality.